So I don't know whether your mind's blown yet after that first session. I was busy scribbling away, typing lots of notes, and realised halfway through there might be some things I might want clarified here. And if that's the truth for me, I'm sure it's true for you. So if there are things that Elaine talked about in the previous session or talks about in this one that you want her to clarify or explain or go through, we can use the panel time for that too. So do make a note of any questions that you've got that might be raised by what she shares, and we'll try and make sure that everyone leaves understanding it all as best we can. Well, I can't promise that, but we'll try. Yeah. So I'm going to hand over to Elaine again now, and she's going to lead us in our next session, and then we'll have another break and then go into our panel time. Thanks, Elaine.
You're welcome. Great. So we're continuing then with the critique of how we got here and what's been wrapped up in underneath, going on under the surface. And what I want to do in this second lecture is look at not how the church has been responding to the gender issue and transgender, but the critics from the secular world and why they have been critiquing this, and especially the feminist critique, which has actually been very powerful and has in many ways polarized the whole issue for a lot of people. So we start with a quote from Michael Briggs, who is a professor of sociology at Oxford, or was then. And he too is raising this straight away about the impact that the media have had on raising the whole issue of transgender, and actually, in his view, has encouraged young people to start fearing and being anxious in areas where they had no need to be fearing and being anxious. So the media's not been educating public on gender issues, it's been promoting awareness and acceptance of transgender theory as uncontested truth. And this is a very big takeover by the media. Once you normalize, once you relativize everything else, so that this is simply truth, and you accept it or you don't, and if you don't, then we will punish you, with no debate about this hypothesis, which replaces gender identity as the new reality replacing biological sex. Nor has any public debate been possible in a climate where anyone questioning it is judged as bigoted, transphobic, and in need of re-education. And we just saw those people who actually suffered, they themselves became martyrs for their view. Nor has any public debate been possible in a climate where anyone questioning it has been judged. And so the questioning has gone on in a whole range of ways, including people who are involved in counselling, people who are involved in medical work and so on. And this is a challenge to the whole idea of gender dysphoria. One of the people involved in this, Kate Grimes, has asked, is this really, are we now classifying everything as gender dysphoria, being out of touch with the sexuality you were born with, when really what's going on under the surface is a whole range of other issues that we're not bothering with. We're not looking at carefully enough and doing it in depth because we're lumping it in one category. And so what she has risen as an alternative list, if you like, of some of the reasons why girls in particular are now identifying as trans or wanting to transition, and that we need to be looking at. Experience of being bullied, school, peers, social media. The level of bullying has never been higher, I understand, than it is currently amongst young people at school, and especially the advent of social media and the way you can be bullied on Facebook or a whole range of much more youth-orientated websites is very important. Media impact, particularly advertisements. The advertisements are, in a sense, we get used to them as we get older, shrug our shoulders, ignore them and all the rest of it, but actually they're making an enormous impact on younger people, and we don't always give credibility to the level of impact they have. Bodily appearance, incredibly glamorous people on ads, whatever they're doing, and an obsession with perfection, even the whole entertainment industry and the rock stars and so on. The bodily appearance so that you're dissatisfied with your own body. We have evidence of little girls as young as 7 and 8 dieting, going on a very strict diet because their bodies are no longer acceptable to them. And then build-up of anxiety. We've had about 3 reports done by the NSPCC and different universities over the last 10 years. And the last one pointed to the fact that this was a higher level of anxiety amongst young people, young children today, than in any of the previous surveys that they had done. And anxiety about just about everything. anxiety about schoolwork, relationships, home life, parents, identity, future, climate change, and so on. And it was bundled into a massive kind of thing. And the answer to a crisis of anxiety and build-up is not transitioning, but yet it's often seen by the child, well, this is a way out. And then social isolation, feeling a misfit. There are dozens of reasons why kids at school feel misfits. We live next door to a primary school. I listen to the noise in the class, in the playground. It's scary sometimes, really scary. And this is a nice school, but you can hear some of the kids letting others have it in no uncertain terms. And you're thinking, how are they going to cope? And the social isolation, not being part of a group, being pushed out of the edges, and often because you're not manifesting the same kind of values and attitudes towards body, towards relationships, towards appearance and so on as the others, then you become ostracized. And what's the answer? Transitioning. Well, no, it's not. But that, again, is something that people can begin to feel. Then envy of others, envy of the opposite gender, and a lot of people studying young women have argued that this is a very high level. Boys can walk freely and not worrying about their safety in public places or non-public places. Boys don't have to worry about their appearance, their puberty as they're growing, they just grow bigger, whereas girls now have to have the right kind of breasts, the right kind of shape, and the right kind of anatomy and so on to actually be interesting to other people. So the looking over the shoulder at the opposite sex and saying, well, actually, that would save us a lot of bother if we just became like that, and wanting the freedom. And most of the feminists are arguing that wrapped up into this is a girl's own sense of non-attraction to men, and therefore she must either be a lesbian or needs to be a transgender person. Then the parental breakup, what's going on in the home, sadly, very sadly, has a big, big link with transitioning and everything else. The sense of guilt, we couldn't keep these parents together. We weren't the right person, right child that this parent wanted. The absent parent, the fleeing parent leaves behind havoc, even when they try not to. And when they don't try not to, then I've been involved enough in therapy with young people and older people to know the catastrophe, really, left behind when a parent, especially a father with a little girl, exits the family, and then the girl feels it was something to do with me, I wasn't good enough, and especially when that person then goes on to a second family and has children that they're very attached to, the original child can feel extremely isolated. And there's a lot of transitioning going on in that context too. The leaving parent and the right kind of child wanting to be. Link with the experience of autism. I didn't know anything about this until someone in our village who's very skilled in this area and has done a lot of work on it was finding this over and over again. Then I went into the body of knowledge that's been formed on girls transitioning and found that this is quite a high thing. It's also interesting that the only trans man I know in the Christian church, and I know this person quite well, having worked with him for several years now, was also had experience of autism. Was a very strong experience. It's also interesting that he had a lesbian mother. So the qualifications, the kind of build-up of things in the home, he can explain his own transitioning in this way, and he doesn't in a sense mind if other people do this, because he feels it's really there staring at him in the face, but nevertheless he still wanted to transition and feels comfortable having transitioned. Experience of abuse, sexual abuse, touching, harassment, and all the rest of it has unknown kind of consequences. And the consequences can last for years. Again, I've been with people who remember incidents in their childhood that they never got reconciled to or never got therapy about, never resolved, and revisit them in later life, middle age or whatever. And it becomes a huge issue. And a lot of people transitioning later in life are transitioning because of experiences in childhood that were unresolvable at the time. And body hatred. I think we're probably in an era of body hatred that's like no other. People hating their own bodies. And to some extent, I'm not sure that the lockdown and pandemic hasn't increased that. as we've had the level of skin hunger in our culture must have grown, because we were already reading about it in great proportions before lockdown. The sense that it's now inappropriate to touch somebody else's body unless you ask their permission, and then that becomes very strange in the relationship. We can no longer have normal relationships where we hug each other and so on. Permission has to be sought and so on. Now, at one level, that's perfectly right. That's what we need to do. We need to be sure that we don't invade somebody else's bodily space with our own intimacy without them feeling comfortable about this. But when it reaches the kind of proportions that it has reached, it means that an awful lot of people never have their bodies touched at all, never have their arms stroked or an arm around their shoulders or whatever. And the level of body hunger that produces, skin hunger, I think is really quite remarkable. And again, transitioning is often seen as a way out. It's something you can do with your body. You can do with something with your body that means you have control over it, and it, in some senses, substitutes for what you're not receiving in your body. An ability to accept parental love, that incredible, sad situation where parents love their kids desperately. They love and love and love and give and give and give, and the kid just doesn't seem to be able to accept this for whatever reason. Needs to be sought out, and then transposes all kinds of attitudes onto the parents that the parents don't have, and so on. But there's something going on in whole family life in our culture that really, I think, cries out loud for Christian help and Christian therapy and Christian modeling of a different kind of approach and helping those people struggling in this area. And then depression. There's an awful lot of depression going on in young people, not surprisingly when you look at the list so far. An awful lot of suicidal feelings with unidentifiable sources. And increasingly, when the source of your anxiety, the source of your suicide or depression or whatever, suicidal feelings and depression, is unidentifiable, an obvious identifying factor now becomes gender. Oh, it's probably because I'm in the wrong body. It's probably because I need to transition and be the other sex. And then these problems will disappear. Of course, they don't, and that's the other aspect of transgender. Problems very often continue well into transition and beyond then. And still the same problems continue, they just have a different meaning and a different location because the person has transitioned. And then generational family patterns of transitioning. This, again, has come to light over and over again. Where you get a mother transitioning or a father transitioning, the chances of a child transitioning are very, very high indeed. Where you get a mother's expectation that this child is already born into the wrong body, then it's all set up already for that kind of thing. So Kate Grimes says we have to be very cautious about lumping everything into this whole idea of gender dysphoria, using transitioning as a way out of fundamental problems, social, economic, and psychological and emotional problems that people have in our culture. And I would add to that spiritual problems. Very often people's spiritual problems end up with them transitioning to become a member of the opposite sex. Because this is what they feel God is leading them to, and this is where they will feel now comfortable in their own body. There's a more sinister argument as well as all of that. And the sinister argument is related to what's generally called the gender-industrial complex. Now, there's an awful lot of theories, conspiracy theories attached to this, and I offer these to you then with a request that you take them A, with a pinch of salt, but B, that you analyze them for yourself. But there is some truth in them, and this is why I want to share, that you actually do get, and this is, people have pointed this out very fully, you do get quite lucrative sponsorships from pharmaceutical companies and medical providers, and the growth of investment in finding ways to help people transition, increasing, their in terms of puberty, beta blockers, and a whole range of other things, puberty blockers rather. Then that is actually going on as we speak, and the pressure on funding is really quite a remarkable thing going on now. So the various organizations, the big organizations like Stonewall, which are LGBTQI organisations have got large budgets, and they've got an awful lot of clout. They've got clout in the media. They've also got clout in pharmaceutical industries, but clout too in campaigning and action across the world for various things. This is where I think that it might a little be overstated. I'm not sure that the movement is seriously bankrolled by 3 American billionaires. You're always hearing these American billionaires are bankrolling everything. But it's certainly the case that there is a lot of money around in transgender promotion and transgender products and so on, and somebody is profiting by it. So the Open Society funds that promote progressive rights-based processes for legal are all part of the system that wants to see this spread. Advocates of hormonal theory, counselling and gender-affirming surgeries and so on, because people are benefiting from these things in a fairly public way. What I didn't know about until I actually started working on this lecture for you is that some of these companies have come together, and I should have known about it because it's been happening for a number of years now, to form a Transgender Day of Remembrance. So they've now got a database of victims throughout the world, trans murder monitoring, and I think the last monitor number we have is 350 trans victims of violence in the year from October 2019. I looked very carefully at this data. I analysed it and I compared it with the sources and where the murders were supposed to take place. Most of them were actually in Central and South America. It's also interesting that a large, substantial minority of these murders were for people who were involved in prostitution, whether that was male prostitution or female prostitution. So immediately, is this because they were trans? Is this because they're in a very, very dangerous area of life and are vulnerable from the start and are going to, in many senses, putting themselves at risk from people who are going to do them harm? Prostitution is a horrible way of life, not because it's immoral, but because it makes the person incredibly vulnerable, incredibly open to risk, and incredibly likely to be violated by the person who is using the prostitute's services. So the idea of somehow that these are trans victims of trans violence rather than victims of violence because of because of the vulnerability of their way of life, I think again needs to be challenged. Nevertheless, Trans Day of Remembrance has been widely observed in Britain. So I turned up the number of university websites and found that, yeah, they were there. Candles being lit for each of the victims, transgender flags raised, speakers invited, services held, and so on. Now, that's all very good, very interesting, and of course we want to protect any vulnerable person, whether they're trans, whether they're homosexual, whether they're prostitutes or whoever. People need to be protected, and we need to have protective legislation to make sure that persons are not at risk from other persons of violence. But let's get the facts into the whole idea of the Transgender Day of Remembrance. When you put it alongside any other area of violence in our culture, it disappears into oblivion, unfortunately. Whilst no transgender person has been murdered, as far as I know, in the United Kingdom, including in the last figures in 2020, we now know that one woman is killed by a partner every 3 days in the same United Kingdom. And most of whom are in fact either current partners or ex-partners. Since Sarah Everard was murdered, 81 women, until this was a figure that I got 2 weeks ago, so it'll be higher than this now, 81 women had been murdered since then by a man, most of whom were their partners. And the whole area, therefore, again, of focusing on trans violence or atrocities committed to trans people we need to put that in perspective also. I want you to look at the faces of these women. Who are they? Well, they were just women killed by their partners in January and February last year. Or was it the year before, actually? I mean, I've got a much bigger picture now that comes out. And how do we know that? We know it because there is a woman who is a feminist who is committed to writing their obits, to commemorating their lives, to recording their deaths, and to letting people know that this is going on in our culture. Her name is Karen Ingalla Smith. She's an atheist agnostic. She has very, very little time for Christianity or the church. She thinks we're all wet. She thinks we're just completely out of touch with justice, reality, and what's going on in the world, and is a challenge to us. I love this woman. I think she's gives herself fully and openly to other people. That's her on the left, my left. We very often share a platform together. She has very little time for my views as Christian, but nevertheless, I'm persisting, praying for her, staying in touch, and I really believe that God is working in her life in a whole range of ways, but that's my hope. She may not recognize that, but she's a person of incredible commitment, as are many people like her. Many of these women have got incredible commitments because they care about other women. Why would she start to collect the names of unknown women who have been murdered across the United Kingdom and increasingly across the world, because she's linked up with other researchers? And she does it because these people matter. They're not just lumps of flesh. They're not just autonomous choice or somebody else's victim or somebody else's subject for a violation. They're human persons who matter. And I would add, they matter because God has created them to matter. Because we are made in the image of God. We do have dignity. We do have worth. It's built into our very personhood as human persons. And Karen recognizes that. She recognizes it so deeply, even without the Christian framework to give her the understanding, the recognition of it. And it's easy to work with people like Karen because they are where justice is. They are where what is mattering in those areas of life that many of us otherwise wouldn't know about. What about then the media surveys? There's an organization called Transgender Trends, which again is another organization committed to trying to get at the facts about transgender in our culture today, trying to get at the numbers that are thrown around, but also the risks that are thrown around when children start to self-identify as transgender. And this is the media survey. They've dug out lots and lots of medias where the facts are distorted, where the evidence given doesn't match the incidents happening and so on. And this is their conclusion. It's not that the editors are unaware of at least some of the risks and questions around diagnosing and treating children as transgender, but that they choose largely to minimize them and continue to publish cheerleading child transition stories as if the issue is settled. And if you look at the stories that they do publish, a lot of these media outlets, they are about a child who is struggling, unhappy, not getting on with his parents or her parents, feeling isolated at school, and then they transition. And they start to feel much better, they're in the right clothes, they've got the right friends, and life is suddenly okay. And then it's the end of the story, the happy ending story for a transitioning child. In fact, the reality is much more complicated than that. Very much more complicated, because the question of who am I isn't resolved by transitioning. Who am I? If I'm not a person made in the image of God by a divine authority who loves me and has a purpose for my life, who am I? And that's the cry, I believe, of our generation, and it's the cry behind an awful lot of gender transitioning. Not all of it, but an awful lot of it. It's a cry for identity. Finally, want to go on to the whole issue of women's, the feminist issue and arguments about transgender. Radical feminists have been probably the most vehement critics of transitioning, but actually, of course, again, their focus is very different whether the focus is on trans men or trans women. The focus on trans men is a focus of anxiety. They feel that somehow or another these girls have been conned. These girls have been conned to disrespect their own bodies, to know their own freedom, to know their value as women, to want to actually be like men because men have a better time, or they have an easier life, or they're more accepted and so on, and because they feel that they're not feminine enough and so on. And because they have inherent senses of attraction to their own sex, which they feel repulsed about. They are potentially lesbian people, but they feel repulsed about lesbianism, so they feel it's safer to transition and be boys. And so therefore they're very strong in what we do with young girls who are wanting to transition. We help them to find themselves in a different kind of way. And help themselves. If they are lesbians, let's make it free for them to be attractive as lesbians, and let's honor their choices in those directions. And they're very vehement about this. Many of the radical feminists are themselves lesbian, and in professions where they can help other women in this area. As far as trans women are concerned, and then they have a very different attitude. They're extremely angry about men who transition and begin to occupy safe spaces of women in a whole range of ways. And I want to take you through the arguments they give for wanting to oppose the wide scale. They're not opposed to individual men transitioning when they feel they really have had gender dysphoria and so on. But as a phenomenon, as a wide-scale phenomenon that's been championed and propagated in the culture, they're very opposed to it. And these are their reasons. And I think it's worth taking through because they are so vehement in our society at the moment. And the polarization is between the campaign for transitioning and the radical feminists. Men who transition to women in adulthood cannot know what it is like to be a woman, and the impact of female biology on a girl's life and our subsequent growth into adulthood. They've never experienced the limitations, the fears, the objectification, the sexual assault that women fear, and therefore they can't begin to know what it means to be a woman. In other words, they become women at a time when they haven't gone through the pain and the difficulties of growth that some of these younger girls have experienced. Men who believe they experience the feelings and emotions of women are simply projecting what they associate with women onto themselves. Since they do not know what it is to be a woman, these projections are often fantasy. I had that experience of a trans woman I know who has definitely got a view of what it is like to be a woman, and sees me as one of her best buddies because I'm a feminist, and therefore she feels that she can share a lot of this stuff with me. And I listen to this with mounting horror because I don't identify with her feelings. Because they're not her feelings. It's not what she's been through. And she's speaking really almost as somebody who has empathized with women, probably empathized for a very long time, but has not been a woman and therefore doesn't experience it at the same depth. And it's very hard. It's very hard with in a relationship like that. This particular person is in the church. We are good friends. She's got used to the fact that I have a different framework from her, a different Christian framework, and we get on very well. The difficulty between the two of us in a relationship is not that she wants me to call her a woman. I call her a woman. This is her choice. This is how she has become identified with people. It would be rude, it would be offensive not to accept her as a woman. So that's not an issue. Her issue is that she wants me to experience her as a woman. And that is more difficult because that then puts the onus on me to say, okay, I experience you as a woman. When I'm hugging you, I'm hugging a woman. I'm not. I'm hugging a male body. It feels like a male body. I'm hugging somebody who has transitioned to be a woman, but actually wouldn't be identifiable that easily as another woman. So it's difficult because the relationships, I'm sharing this because this is one of the things we face in the church. The relationships are difficult because the onus is often on the non-transition person to go the extra mile with the transition person for their needs. They need this from us. And yet, with all kind of conscience and from my own integrity, one can't do that. One can't say what you don't experience. So the right is for the trans person to say exactly what they feel they experience, but the right is denied for the non-trans person to say what they experience because then it becomes offensive. It's non-accepting, it's non-inclusive, and so on. And somehow or another we have to face this in the church because it's a big issue. Men as women invading female-only spaces present a threat and a challenge to women seeking safety and solace among other women. An awful lot of this stuff is about whose toilets we can use. When a woman goes into a toilet and finds a person in a woman's dress but with a penis, it becomes a very difficult issue. Because especially if women who've been violated, have been attacked by men, or have felt uncomfortable with men for whatever reason, to have a woman who actually has a male anatomy, because the argument is you can have a penis and be a woman, there's no requirement for you to have undergone any surgical realignment or surgical change. It's not about a penis, it's not about a cervix, it's about what I choose to be. So self-defining as a woman, with yet a male anatomy and maybe some hormonal changes and drugs, remains a threat for many, many women, whether they're in women prisons, women educational institutions, women cloakrooms or whatever. And it's very difficult to get this across. And of course, the radical feminists are also building up lists of women who have been killed by trans women to make their point. That they are few, let me say straight away. This doesn't happen. Most trans women are not going around killing other women. But the issue is still there, and it has to be recognized as a real issue. Trans women often dress and have bodily enhancements which fulfill this sexy stereotype, the old stereotype of sexy, attractive women, and therefore further objectify women and downplay the authenticity of women who don't feel these stereotypes. And I think this is a very big issue. If you look at the best-known trans women, they're trying to show that they're more sexy than women, they're more kind of attractive, they're more alluring and so on. And they occupy the central stage in a lot of entertainment industry and so on, like Caitlyn Jenner, and the whole issue of glamour. We can be glamorous, and it's almost as if, of course, they're having to prove they're women and not men. But there's something also about the underlying attitude about women, what it's saying about a definition of women. This is what women ought to look like, and I look like this, and therefore, as a trans woman, I'm leading this scene. And then two other final points that they make in the same thing. Trans women often exhibit the same strident, assertive, and dominant attitudes of men who haven't transitioned to women. I listen to my feminist friends saying this, and I have met trans women precisely like that. The one I know most is very strident, very aggressive, wants to win an argument and so on. And not that all men are like this by any stretch of the imagination, but she is. And therefore it's very hard to actually step back and kind of accept this as an acceptable way forward. They use the media, they say, to denounce women who oppose them and are not welcome in women's companies or gatherings. And I've seen probably more argument and more vehement and more name-calling and more nastiness between radical feminists and trans women who are out to get them than in many areas of life I've been involved in. Cases of predatory men using their trans women's status have been growing and pose a need for vigilance. A woman with a penis is not a woman and is certainly not a female. Biology might not be destiny, but it still has some say in the matter of sex and gender. Now what's happened here is very, very interesting, because as the rest of the culture has gone postmodern, gone gender fluid, the radical feminists have gone back to biology. This is extraordinary. The radical feminists are not postmodern. On the whole, they're people who have got old-fashioned ideas about justice, about equality, about difference, and about truth. And that's very, very interesting when you look at the sweep of our culture and our society and where we have gone, what we have moved on to. The rest of my PowerPoints have somehow eliminated themselves, so I'll just speak and then shut up. Where are we now? A few more minutes left. So, what's interesting in terms of not just the mismatch between the facts of transgender and the arguments, but also the level at which the opposition to the endorsement of the phenomenon of transgender has been led by women, and particularly these women who are themselves feminists and have these reasons. There's a woman particularly called Sheila Jefferies, whom I met and went to listen to because she's an outstanding researcher, but also has some very pointed things to say. Again, one has to take a lot of it with a pinch of salt and weigh up the facts yourself. Because she's arguing that transgender women are either homosexual men who feel that they can be homosexual in the bodies of men or don't feel that it can be, or heterosexual men who have a sexual interest in wearing women's clothes. And that kind of comment produced a great deal of antagonism, and she was accused of being a racist and transphobic and all the rest of it. But her big arguments anchor on the danger of the Gender Recognition Act and the way in which it's enabled medical profession to make millions of people and to make money become dependent on drugs, make people dependent on drugs. And the gender dysphoria certificates, even the cost, and certainly in America, of going towards the diagnosis of gender dysphoria and obtaining all the relevant certification that you need has been pushed by these areas of industry. She's arguing really, she says that some of the areas of concern that we need to look at is the way in which the extreme end of transgendering actually becomes another way of fetishing, servicing men's fetish needs, and reinforcing women's lower status to give sexual excitement. She has a whole catalogue of examples of new transgender porn that's come out of the whole transgender movement, women's degrading, women's sissification, ejaculation when men are forced lipstick on them by the women and so on. Lots of really, really unpleasant pornography that's been growing with the transgender movement. And I saw some of this stuff, and that's why I didn't really want to show it to you, but one particular pornography of lactation, of breastfeeding, that men find breastfeeding exciting. And so being a trans woman who then can actually perform some kind of lactating, even though that they don't have lactation, they don't have milk to come out of their breasts, helps them also to ejaculate. And so what you're doing in a trans body is both using, she says, your parasitically getting your male excitement from a woman's body. And there's a whole industry encouraging men to do this, encouraging men to transition and offering this as a pornographic way forward for transition men who are now trans women. Her argument and conclusion is that trans women are men trapped in men's bodies. And I think that's quite interesting. And the co-paraphilia, the nappy fetishism, sexual interests coming out of the bedroom and so on, sexual perversions, women changing their dirty nappies. There's layers and layers of stuff that I did not want to know about, wish I didn't know about, wish I hadn't seen the images, but I have. And because they are out there and they are undisputable and circulating in the undercurrent of our culture, we have to be recognizing them. We have to recognize the problems that they have and problems that they cause us. Okay, I've once again run out of time. Later on today, I want to look at what the challenges that all of this throws up for us in the church as Christians. The challenge of gender in general throws up both for our theology and our pastoral ministry, throws up for both our relationships and our compassion, throws up for our desire to be salt and light in our country, in our society, and also our need to serve the church and help the generation coming through. But I think at this point it's important to say, how do we go forward? Who do we work with? What do we do with the people in the secular society that we live in who are working in these areas too? And I think I'm wanting to make a plea for listening to the arguments of some of the people that we wouldn't necessarily want to walk with because of their antagonism towards Christianity, because also maybe of their embracing of certain social programs that we wouldn't want to go with, But yet, when we do work with them, I find a tremendous amount of respect and care and sharing that isn't possible in any other way. So I wanted to finish with my own experiences of working with radical feminists on the area of transgender, but also other areas, area of prostitution, area of surrogacy and so on. Lots of areas that they have made a very, very definitive and principled stand. And actually, I admire what they're doing. So I was invited to a big conference. I won't name the conference, but it's a radical feminist conference that's held every year in the UK and attracts thousands of women. And they'd read my book, Scars Across Humanity, and thought it would be good to have this speaker to speak. So I was invited, and I accepted, and delighted to be invited. Then about 6 weeks before the conference, I had a phone call from one of the trustees to no platform me. They wanted to uninvite me to the conference because they discovered not only was I Christian, I was actually an evangelical Christian. And unfortunately, they're the most bigoted, I was told. And the church has no idea where we are on the question of women and gender. And sorry, we don't want you. So I was very taken aback by this call, a little bit kind of ruffled. My husband was very angry. And I said, well, yeah, I see where you're coming from. Yeah, church has got a lot of problems. But, you know, don't put words into my mouth, because you might find I'm saying different words if you ask me what I believed and felt. But nevertheless, I take it, and, you know, I hope you have a really good conference. I'm a praying person, so I'll be praying for you. You know, all the best. Have a great time, and thanks for your interest in the first place. Put the phone down, thought, what a pity. You know, I was really looking forward to that, just the possibility of outreach, of communicating. Well, then about 3 or 4 days later, I had another phone call from another trustee saying, no, we've had a meeting. We do want you to come and speak to our conference. And we're quite keen on this, and we think you've got a lot that you could offer and want to say. And I said, thanks, that's great. I'll come then. That's lovely. 2 more days later, and same trustee again, the initial trustee, no, we don't want you, Elaine. You know, we are at two minds with this. If you come, you will actually die. You will split the group in two, the group of organizers, because half of us don't want you. We really don't want you. And the other half will be willing to tolerate you. But you will be booed from the platform, she said. When you sit up there, people would boo you because they've seen your profile. They know what you stand for. They know you're in this church. You know you're a bigot and so on. I said, all right, fine. Well, I won't come then. I said, I'll carry on praying for you. And then finally, the same woman said, okay, about 2 days later, we're expecting you on the program. If you open up the web page, you will see that we've actually put you as a center of, so that everybody knows that you're speaking, so you can come. Not very graciously. So turned up at this conference. The trustee who obviously didn't like my guts and didn't want me to come met me, looked me up and down, and she'd already come, she'd already heard me speak at another conference, which she just kind of smuggled into the background, and then flung her arms around me as though I was her long-lost best friend. And then, surprisingly, she said, you see that woman over there sitting down on her own in that seat? So I said, yes. She said, you know, her father's just died. I know that you lost your father a little while ago, your mother. Do you think you could just go and talk to her? So I thought, what's she asking me to do? So I said, well, why? She said, I'm no good at this kind of thing. You know, a lot of us aren't any good at this, but you'd be good at it. You'd be really good at it. So I said, well, you know, if in my church, I'd probably just go and pray with her. You know, listen to her, and then we'd pray. Whatever, she says, whatever. So I went and sat down with this woman, and we prayed. I listened to her, and we prayed, and a hug. And she thanked me enormously. I said it was lovely, and it was nice to have spiritual people at the conference, because they hadn't been that noticeable before. But the other thing that happened is all the Christians at the conference came out. And there were many Christians there, young women, professional women working in all kinds of areas, fervently believing in God, wanting to work alongside other women whose values they shared, but whose religious faith they didn't. Because these other people had faith, but it just wasn't in the God that we love and worship. And it was a really important opportunity for cross-fertilization, for listening to one another, and to standing alongside people who disagree with us. So I want to commend that as an important challenge for the church, as we'll be looking at a little bit more tonight, and a missiological opportunity. But we do it not just because it's good evangelism. We do it because it's also justice-seeking, and it's working with those who God works with and works through despite what they think of him. That's it for now. you.